Okay.
All right, sounds good. Thanks. Hey, hello, everybody. We are back for our weekly podcast and weekly conversation, I should say. We have the niche, as always. We have JC behind the mic. We have Sick Pig at the end, and we have two very special guests. We have Azmat Khan, a journalist who has done some really wonderful work that we are going to talk about, and we have Basim Razzo, our friend, the friend of Social 19, and the friend of everyone, most importantly, and an inspiration to so many of us. And if you were watching class yesterday, if you watched the feed, you have a sense of what the two of them will be bringing to the conversation. But I'm going to start out by explaining a little bit to both Basim and Azmat about what this conversation is and how and why it came about. And then it's a nice reminder for those of us who are watching the feed. I think one of the things that 119 has transformed in lots of different ways, but for me as a way of made decisions that the best way to have the kinds of conversations that we want to have is to bring students down into the front and have them talk to one another. And limit the amount of time that I'm talking, because the truth is, people whether they're in the class or watching the stream, the thing that people say over and over again is they're really most interested in listening to the students talk to each other and finding out what they're thinking about these issues. And when we were working on the television show, it was a tough blow to take, but I took it and I changed. The producers said back in the day, listen, after about 14 or 15 seconds of you talking, people watching their televisions are going to tune out. So they're just really not interested in you. They're interested in people in the room. And so I really took that to heart and started to transform the way I taught. And it became so much more interesting for me to hear what it is that students have to say. But what it means is I rarely take the time to put together my own thoughts in the classroom. And so what I did at the very beginning of class yesterday is actually somewhat rare. That even to take 10, 12, or 15 minutes to actually articulate a series of thoughts. And so it just kind of happened as, we are the three producers here are really, kind of engaged with the chat on the stream, and then watching the conversation that happens on the YouTube videos. That people really want to hear more about what goes behind the things that we're talking about, and then people have a lot of questions specifically for me about what was I trying to get at, what did I want to make happen in the classroom when I did X, Y, or Z, when I brought students up and that sort of thing. And so we said, well, why don't we just start having just an audio podcast, and then it turned into audio and video, where I could explain some of the stuff, some of what was behind it, and then we could examine it. Because, here you have Joy and Darnisha and Jeff, all of them who are, watching the whole thing, and they also want to talk, and they have a lot to say. And so, and I want to get feedback from them as people who watch, each class and observe it and watch students and talk to students. And so the podcast really is first and foremost an opportunity to respond to some of the things that happened in the previous week, and then at the same time to just kind of go off in a few different directions. So we'll do some of that today. We'll do most of it today. It'd be really nice to talk about Basim, his work and your work, and then the intersection with Social 119 a little bit deeper than some of the things that we talked about in class. And I think that's where we can start today. So anyway, welcome. That's
a long welcome.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so what do we have? What are some of the things that were really coming up on the stream?
Tuesday was a little bit more Islamophobic, like everyone just taking the things that they believe or have been told through the media throughout the years, especially after 9/11. Whereas on Thursday it seemed to be more interested in questions about them specifically, and then the work that they've done. So we'll probably pull up a little bit more of that. It was more understanding. But yet for some reason people, and this is about most topics, whenever you have somebody who's an expert about something, the people who know nothing about it, including myself, tend to make assumptions, make those assumptions known, and have a very hard time getting away from those assumptions.
So let's why don't we just jump into the Islamophobia piece, and let me actually go to Basim and Azmat, the two of you. What did you think about how I started the class yesterday? Because I was really trying to dive into that and steer into that curve a good deal, and talking about Christianity and making the link and so on. What were some of the thoughts that you had? Because that was a little bit provocative, I think.
Okay, so really I was
You're going to want to get real close to the mic.
that you connected Islam and Christianity, and how you explained that not only Muslims commit bad acts, but Christians have committed really, really much more acts of violence against other people and among themselves. So I was very happy that you made the connection right away and you set the path to go from there.
And did you feel? Were there a couple points when you were feeling uncomfortable, like maybe as though I was pushing Christians a little hard, or?
Yes, Sam, you're known for being criticized, that you are sometimes go really far away for criticizing. But yes, at the beginning I thought probably Christians will say this guy is saying this because he has a Muslim or 2, 3, 4 Muslims sitting in the class, and you were trying to be nice to us. But then I really understood the connection you made between the two religions.
Azmat, how about you? And you can just pull the microphone even down to you, whatever is easiest for you.
Sure. Well, it actually reminded me of a piece I often assign to my students in a course I taught at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism about reporting on terrorism. And the piece is called The Myth of Religious Violence. It's by Karen Armstrong, who's a religious scholar who really looks at the history of wars going back not just to the Crusades, but looks at how we've interpreted things as religiously motivated when there are very deeply layered contexts involved, intersecting local histories that we've forgotten, and that by looking at those histories, we can better understand the prism through which people today misidentify violence often as religious violence, when it's incredibly layered and deeply politicized. And there are all of these different aspects. So I, as I was listening to that, I was thinking back to some of those readings and how this is always so complicated. And it really requires trying to understand history and understanding the intersection of the local histories and these grander macro histories.
Yeah. I like, the war is never about one thing. Violence is never about one single thing, right? And people ask me, someone made a comment, I think, on the YouTube video from yesterday's class about, religion, how about just religion as the cause of violence? And I'm like, well, religion is really it's never the single cause of violence. It's always layered, right? Even if it's a religiously inspired, people are going to be violent toward one group as opposed to another, but there's something else going on behind that, some kind of history that's political or economic or social or something. And
Or manipulation.
what's that?
Manipulation.
Yeah. That idea of Nazis as Christians.
It makes so many people mad and
It
uncomfortable.
really does. They say, well, they weren't really Christians. Well, tell them that. These Muslims aren't really Muslims. That's the thing. If you're going to give them if you're going to make that argument with Germans, then you're going to have to make that argument with ISIS, right? And so.
And I did notice that a lot of people were like, well, with ISIS people, like, they're just, we will say that they're extremists, but yet they're terrorists and they hide among people. And it's just like, yeah, but most of them that I've heard many accounts in which they talk about the reason why people join ISIS is for financial stability. Because they make money, they're able to give these these fighters, these terrorists that we call them, they probably wouldn't call themselves the same thing, but what we call terrorists, they're able to support their families. So like, it's not just, oh, they believe in this extremist version of Islam. Most of them don't know what it says.
Well, maybe we can deconstruct that a little bit.
Yes,
this is one of
please.
the issues in Afghanistan, of course. So many folks that are illiterate, right? So Rafi, my colleague Rafi, tells lots and lots of stories about people who with extremist ideas.
So the illiterates are those who, when you talk about religion, you can get their attention and you grab their minds and hearts to go into any war.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I meant by manipulation.
You got to get closer.
Understanding that being a tool in a lot of the areas or certain villages, just due to the geographic circumstances that their education, someone else could come in and just tell them, this says this, and if you follow this, or if you have respect for our religion, then you're going to believe what I say and fight with my cause because I told you that this is what it says and it's so.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know that it's not because they can't read it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with slavery and
Well,
Christianity.
Same thing with Christianity.
Catholicism
Vast
for a
majority of
long
Christians
time.
have never read the Bible. They have no idea what it says.
Mhm.
Really,
Well,
honestly,
it's because they never translated the Bible, and so they went to the church, and then the priest was
Yeah.
up there, and they were like, so you've sinned. What's a sin? Well, I'll tell you what a sin is. Well, how do I get rid of the sin? I'll tell you how to get rid of it. You have to pay us
yeah.
to do
Yeah,
X, Y, and Z. And so it created a structure in which people were
Yeah.
then crusading throughout Europe, which we don't talk about the Christian Crusades and violence, but yet we'll talk about Muslims and violence in the Middle East because it's now.
Yeah, well, it's of course, right? It's now. It's what's really happening, and so hey, but listen, can we go to that question about ISIS and payments and belief versus actually looking for some kind of stability, or like, and being driven by ideology versus a kind of stability, because Azmat, I know that you know a lot about this, so. It's like what's driving so many people?
Right.
Yeah.
I think there are different schools of thought on why people have joined ISIS, and one of those schools of thought is that people were ideologically motivated by the religious tenets of Islam that drew them to it, and I think that may be the case for a small number of particular leaders within it, but there are incredibly fascinating histories and context that developed this. And so we can go back in time and we can see how the suppression of socialist movements and pan-Arab movements basically eroded certain kinds of political avenues that people could express themselves through in the 70s, 80s, etc. So that religious or political Islam became a means through which it was one of the few alternatives left under a dictator in terms of political expression. Now, this is the kind of thing people don't talk about when we think about the grand history of how we got to where we are or how ISIS came to power. That's one part of it. And when you start digging deeper, you see that there are the intersections of so many different causes. When I was interviewing people on the ground in these territories that had been retaken from ISIS in Iraq and Syria, I would ask them, when ISIS took over, what did you first think? What was your first impression? And there were many people who told me, I welcomed this in some ways. And they weren't just citing the corruption of their own government and the disenfranchisement that particularly many Sunnis felt. Some of them said, I had never had a chance to learn about my religion, and finally I did. They said they would have daily prayer 5 times a day, and I never really had a chance to have that. And this is not something, I heard this repeatedly, but the denial of a religious education allowed, sort of an interest when it was exposed to them through a group that is incredibly nefarious in its interpretation of that religion, opened up a space. And it's something I've heard from other journalists. There's an extraordinary journalist named Azadeh Moaveni who also writes for The Times as well, and she has a new book out called Guest House for Young Widows. And it's the story of 13 different women who joined or collaborated with or tried to join ISIS at various points in time. And it's really interesting to me that some of the women in the region, so women from other Arab countries like Tunisia and Libya, and how the suppression of religion, the sort of focus on secular education, allowed for there to be an absence of religious knowledge that allowed others to take advantage of them and manipulate them when it came to religion. And so that's an interesting factor But when you're looking at local context, a lot of what I've just described in terms of that work was international. But when you're looking at places in Syria, when a new government takes power, right, like this new group has taken over and it looks like it is here to stay, it has broad popular support, what do? Do you close down your tobacco shop and find some other kind of livelihood that is not going to be penalized? Yes. Do you marry? And some of these women describe in Azade's book, marrying ISIS fighters because their families were poor and this would radically change their situation in this new state that had formed. They didn't like ISIS. Some women joined, the ISIS religious police, hated it, resented that they were a part of it. Women who didn't believe even in head coverings, but did this as a means of survival in this. And sometimes it's not just survival. Sometimes it's, profit motivated. Sometimes it's, there are a litany of things for why people do what they do, but you only start to understand it when you can pull back from these sort of overarching narratives about why people do what they do or why people join ISIS. And you start to look at the factors on the ground. And I think, Basim can describe in detail some of the people from Mosul that he knew, people in their community were shocked to hear had joined ISIS, and why, and also why were people in the beginning, at least, many people in Mosul were excited when ISIS took over. What were some of the reasons you saw?
Yeah, just like Azmat said, some people, so many different people joined ISIS for different circumstances. Some, they were looking for prestige, and just wearing the Afghani, carrying a gun in the middle of the street, ordering people to grow your beard, wear Afghani, go to prayer, shut down your office. This is not Islamic. So they felt prestigious. Reading and listening to that book, most of them, they came, like the girl from Morocco. Since she was a child, she believed that she had to wear the veil. And she was in turmoil because she decided to go to school with it. And she was the first girl to wear the school. And she said to her mother, well, you are this is a sin because you're not wearing. So she was convinced. ISIS members are so many parts. She was kicked out of school, for wearing the niqab. So people at the beginning, when they entered Mosul, people of Mosul felt they were oppressed by the central government, being a Sunni, and the central government being mainly Shia. Some people felt oppressed. They have lost their jobs when they were in the previous regime. Roads were closed. We had checkpoints all over. To go from point A to point B, we had to go through 3 to 4 military checkpoints. So when ISIS came to Mosul, all of this was gone. Every neighborhood will only have one entrance, and if your house was all the way to the end of your neighborhood, you had to go through this checkpoint and come out of it, and you will be searched, and you'll be asked for your ID. So when ISIS came to Mosul, they have studied the mentality of the people. And the first thing they did, the first week, they opened every road that was closed in the city. So people, they felt, oh my God, this is freedom.
Yeah.
We've been suffering of these checkpoints for 10, 15 years. These people are helping.
Yeah.
At the beginning, when ISIS entered Mosul, they were smiling at you. They were trying to help you. They were so nice to you. But for anybody who had known their history, he will know that this was very temporary. They were asking for support, and then they will change their behavior, and that was what happened 2 to 3 months later.
So this was calculated on. That behavior was calculated.
Exactly,
on, right?
very well orchestrated.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And have you seen that elsewhere? Did you see that also in Syria and in other places? That ISIS operates in the same way? They come in thoughtfully and with a friendly disposition, and then they turn.
Yeah, I mean, this has been documented well by journalists in particular who've obtained the sort of original blueprint ISIS had for how it would enter communities. It's planned for both Iraq and Syria. And essentially, there's sort of a breakdown that you'll see in these documents, and they show you that they would start to outline important members of the community. You know, who matters in this community? Which families can we marry into? Which families can we get to support us? What should we do to those who don't? Can we get information to bribe people with? Can we figure out what the sources of political discontent and frustration are, and can we address those firsthand? And this blueprint was used in cities and towns across Iraq and Syria. They worked their ways into existing protests by nonviolent actors in cities like Ramadi and Hawija, places where people felt very disenfranchised by their own government, where there had been violent crackdowns by their own government, by the Iraqi Air Force, by Iraqi forces, and they wormed their way into these protests. They offered different solutions, and one of the big ones in Syria is that they were offering justice, these quick courts for what was, referred to as Islamic justice, and people who were so used to cases languishing in the system or to people going free. Many people in Syria and in certain rural areas really found this powerful, particularly amidst this revolution that was happening and this broad sort of uprising in which there were all of these rebels and very little state apparatus or means for justice. And so, yes, this was a calculated effort. They exploited political grievances expertly, but you also can't ignore the fact that over decades, political alternatives had been decimated, and also the fact that the 2003 invasion of Iraq allowed for, this wild unrest, and in that chaos, for religious zealots to seize pulpits in Iraq and take advantage of things. And all of these factors together have contributed to the rise of ISIS. You can't just talk about the local dynamics at the time that ISIS came about. You have to look back at the American invasion of Iraq and the space that created for what would become Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And you have to look at the decimation of socialist and pan-Arab movements in the 70s and 80s. The absence of that created space for groups like ISIS to ultimately form, or at least for religious political motivations to really emerge as a means of protest.
Yeah, I think about Egypt and Nasser, right? I think about that as I in my mind made some connections there. My mentor was a scholar of Nasser. Hey, I'm just thinking about, just stay with this for a second. So I'm one of my areas of expertise, I suppose, as you want to say, in sociology is social movements. So my primary area is political economy and development. My second area is social movements. So as you're talking about ISIS and these kind of blueprints and so on, I think, wow, well, that's the blueprint of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? It's the blueprint of every social movement across the board, right? I mean, it's and every sort of revolutionary process, including the ones that we think about. I was telling you about when students took over the hub here at Penn State 19 years ago, and I think, well, that was the first thing they did was sort of walk into a room and start looking at all the key actors on campus and like who did they know and who could they bring on their side and who do they have dirt against, and one thing after another, and how could they really bring them into the fold. They were very strategic and very thoughtful about that. And then the points at which they knew they had to turn direction, like go 90 degrees in a different direction, and everybody said, wow, what changed? Your rhetoric, your ideas, your thoughts have completely changed. So yeah, because we had to get to this point before we could make the next step, and now we're here, and now we're going to take the next step. So I think, well, this is sort of basic sociology, right? I think, wow.
To me, it sounds a lot like a sheep skin, or a wolf hiding in sheep skin.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But if you're going to be successful as a social movement actor, if you really want to make your case and change society, you better be very thoughtful in key ways, and you're going to have to also do some things that people aren't going to like, but you got to be a couple steps ahead. And these were some really smart people, right? ISIS is not. They're not being led by.
They were smart. They are so organized.
Yeah.
They had sleeping cells all over the city. So the day they entered, young people emerged. Everybody knew where to be. In every situation, every day.
Yeah.
And then so many people that I knew were my friend, the next day they were Afghani. And I've known them like this.
Describe what you mean by
Afghani, okay. The clothing they wear, we call it Afghani. So they have so many different colors. The brown are the security forces.
It's a tunic that many ISIS members would wear, a long shirt.
A long shirt for men and long pants.
That goes down below the knees.
Below the knee. Below
the
the
pants.
knee, yeah. So like I will give you one example. There was this shop that used to sell pickles. And I've bought pickles from him for probably 15 years. A week later, I went to get some pickles from him, and he was wearing the Afghan uniform and the brown. The brown uniform was the highest security force in ISIS.
Wow.
And then they had the white, what they call al-Husba. Al-Husba is the people who will follow you and force you to behave, dress, act as a Muslim. And if you don't, then they will punish you. And that's the name al-Husba. Al-Husba comes from Hisab, which is judgment. And then suddenly you had women Husba. And then, because they could not come to a woman and say, the man will not talk to a woman. So they had women force. Everything was so organized, orchestrated. Everybody knew what to do, when, and how.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Did you ever talk to the pickle vendor about why he joined?
When he saw me, usually he had like 3 people work for him. But when I used to go to him, because out of respect for me, he will do the collection for me, and he will add some spices, and he will pick the best. When he saw me, he immediately disappeared because he did not want to talk to me, and he did not want me to see him like this because I was going to talk to him, but he never came out. I saw him, he went to the back of the store, and he did not want to talk to me. Because I don't know. Was he ashamed of being? I don't think he was ashamed, but he used to come to my pharmacy, and he was suffering from infertility, and I will give him medicine. I will tell him what to do. So he wasn't just like a pickle seller for me. He was my client, and he will come to me for every time he has like a test, semen test. He will come to me, and I'll read it to him. I'll tell him what to do. So probably he was with me. He was ashamed to be associated with ISIS, but he was happy. But then he was later killed in a battle. So he was in battle.
Yeah.
He's not.
So
member.
in the battle in Mosul, so he was fighting.
He was fighting and he was killed.
Yeah.
Him and his 2 sons.
Wow. Yeah, it's I'm reminded of how complex the world is. So one of the things we talk about here is this class is very much a class. It's a generalist class, right? That we cover so many different issues, and we never do the same thing twice, or we rarely do anyway. And so we have to be generalists in so many ways, which means you know just enough to say really ignorant and dumb things that people on the live stream or wherever can call out, because they're always experts. Everybody, somebody always knows more than I do about anything it is that I'm talking about. Well, many people do, obviously, but I think that I just think about this issue and the immense complexity. And so here, the 2 of you, Basim, is someone who lived in a community that was taken over, a city that was taken over by ISIS, and then went through the process and of living among ISIS. And then Azmat, you, who, as we talked about in class yesterday, I mean, this is just the amount. Forget about the challenging work and the courageousness and so on, but the fact that you just have spent so much time just very carefully and thoughtfully collecting data, that you understand things that the vast majority of people will never understand. And I think, how is it that any of us can sit around and have opinions about these kinds of things and really know nothing? And so I think for me, I've been blessed to meet enough just incredibly thoughtful and smart and knowledgeable people about almost most of the subjects that I talk about, that I'm smart enough to know how much I don't know, and then humble enough, really, because I just know it's just so complex. And I think about what I think that my message always in both the class and in whether it's the podcast or the stream or whatever is to say, slow down. There's information out there that we don't know and we don't understand. As we were talking about last week with police violence, we had a really interesting conversation.
There was a question on the chat that probably should be addressed, because I'm interested in hearing your views of it. But what is an infidel? Because we hear constantly infidels and that connected to Islam, but what is an infidel?
Well, an infidel is any person who does not abide by Quran, Sharia. So anything you do outside of the teaching of Quran, Sunnah Nabawiyah, which what Prophet Muhammad said after the Quran, and Sharia, is an infidel. So infidel has so many punishment depending on the severity of the act you do according to their interpretation of Sharia.
So everybody is an infidel.
But that's the term. You're describing it, what an infidel means in Islam. There's also, this term has been used in other religions as well.
Exactly.
So like infidel is also a term that was used in Christianity.
It's still used in Christianity, which means that everyone's an infidel because everybody has an interpretation about what is the truth about their particular ideology.
Could it be equal to, say, sinner with Christians? Because right now I don't know. I've never heard someone in the U.S. that's a Christian talk about the infidels, but we constantly talk about sinners.
Yeah, we've mostly stopped using that word in Christianity. Biblical scholars, Christian scholars, continue to use it, and it's not uncommon, as a way to understand historically and sociologically, the church and so on. But I think the equivalent would be sinners, is how we mostly use it.
And even within Islam, like, it depends on where you are, what you're doing. This term is not used by many Muslims in certain places. It really depends on the context. Like, it's really it's a term that dominates coverage. People are very fascinated by it. It's used by extremist groups in its language and rhetoric, and that often, causes people to believe that that is the dominant thinking, or that the use of this word is a common occurrence, and it's really very particular kinds of people who use it in very particular kinds of spaces.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's once again, this is without spending time around Muslims and from many, many different cultures, and you really don't have an understanding of the degree to which, say, if you're Christian, Islam and Christianity are just so parallel in every way, theologically and sociologically and psychologically, that Muslims and Christians are following two very parallel paths. And I'm speaking as a sociologist, of course, right? But I really see very little difference. Hey, I want to go back, Azmat, to the first thing that you said about spaces that ISIS sort of or this extremist ideology stepping into spaces that opened up as a result of socio-political forces and events over time. And I was thinking about the Pentecostal movement in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century in particular, and how the Pentecostal movement really emerged because so many people didn't read the Bible in the United States. So many Christians did not read the Bible. I mean, this is a really relatively new process or phenomenon. And so people, for the first time, really had an opportunity or were encouraged to pick up the Bible, at least in very few people have ever read it cover to cover, just like the Quran, right? I mean, very few people, you talked about your experience reading the Quran, but very few people have. And how with the Pentecostal movement, different people, so many people don't know, but there were just so many itinerant preachers and Protestant preachers who were evangelical, Pentecostal, traveling the United States, especially in rural areas, in places where people were much more likely to be illiterate and much less likely to have access to thinking about and referencing biblical reality, and really built up these amazing followings because of that. And they filled and radicalized people in lots of different ways because people were really ready for that. They needed a way to jump in or have access to their religion that they didn't have. And so it didn't take much for these sort of preachers to show up at a town and put a tent up and have these 2 and 3 day revivals and bring hundreds and sometimes thousands of people together, and with some really radical ideologies, super anti-Semitic ideologies, anti-Islamic, anti-Catholic, that are calling for paralleling really what happened in Nazi Germany in terms of the Jews and what happened with Jewish people. So,
but it's crazy for you to say talk about that, because I was Pentecostal. Like, my church we're non-denominational, Pentecostal based, and so there are some kind of extreme ideas with the Holy Spirit that we have, and so it's interesting for you to talk, for you to say that, and because I thought, well, I know my Bible, but did I ever read it?
No, exactly.
I would always start January 1st doing those year-long Bible readings, and I would make it to January 4th, and I was like, oh, I missed a day. I missed a second day.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you like the rural part of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, you always, I remember when I was younger, I would go through, phases of trying to be more religious, and I would try and read the Bible, cover to cover, and I would never get past Genesis.
Yeah.
And I just,
Well,
and
that's
it just
pretty
makes
bad.
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, Genesis is pretty violent. The first few books are really violent.
And they're
know.
so boring. God.
Well, it's just
boring.
killing people and God condemning people and just committing acts of genocide. Really.
Well, let's not talk about that for
Okay,
a
we don't
second.
have to
But
pick
Let's talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
yeah.
Well, so the idea is, what I'm always saying is, and this is there's a lecture that I did, or I put together a few years ago, called Christian Sharia, and when I looked at what Sharia is, sociologically, right, and then what it looks like in Christianity, and we are in the middle of a Sharia revolution in the United States, a Christian Sharia revolution in the United States, and so many people are actually, trying to promote Christian Sharia law and would like to live under Christian Sharia law, and at the same time critique Islamic Sharia.
And it's because they don't call it that, though.
Yeah, we don't call it that, but that's what it is.
Totally.
And Azmat, or Basim, do you?
There's a question from a Sarah Cassidy, and she's asking if she wants me to tell a story about one nice thing that Ananias did for me.
Uh-huh.
So there was this guy he used to come to my pharmacy, and he would always get his prescription from me. But then, about 6 months before the invasion, the beginning of the year, he used to come to my pharmacy every week or 10 days, get some medicine, and then for 6 months he disappeared. And then a week after they came into Mosul, he came to my pharmacy, and he was wearing the brown uniform, which is security forces, and he had a gun holstered under his arm with two members of the brown unit having an AK-47 behind him. He'd had a really, really, really long beard, and he comes to me, he said, "Hello, Ammu Basim." And I was sitting in a chair, and I just looked at him. I did not recognize him for the first time. He said, "Don't you recognize me?" And then I said, "Oh my God, you have really long beards." And he said, "Shh." So he did not want to say anything because he had the two guys with him. So he turned around to them. It seems that these two guys were who are responsible for the street where my pharmacy was. And he said, "Listen, this is my uncle. Anything he needs is an order to you. His protection is upon you. And anything you need, just let them know, and I'm at your service."
Wow.
Dude, wow.
Talk about corruption. There's corruption. No, I mean, this is nepotism corruption, right? I mean, this is phenomenal. I mean, it's everywhere, right? You don't get away from it, but that's an amazingly corrupt act. No. Yeah, I mean, you don't get away from it, right? In the end. There are very few pure believers of anything in the world.
So let me go the other extreme and tell you about a really nasty thing they did for me. I had a pharmacy, and I had a pharmacist who is in charge of, but because of the situation, he would not come every day. So probably a couple times, 3 times a week, he would not be there, but I would be running the pharmacy. So comes this guy, blonde hair, wearing white, which is Hasba. I knew him because he had a shop in Duhok where he used to sell perfumes. I know his dad. He was a friend of my later brother Muhammad. He was a teacher at the university. He had a PhD in engineering. His mother was a very well-known doctor in Mosul. So, and about just before ISIS came, I was in Duhok and I bought a perfume for my late wife from him. So he entered and I thought he was coming to say hello to me. His face was straight. He said, "Where is the pharmacist?" Because he knows I'm not a pharmacist. He said, "Where is the pharmacist?" I said, "Well, he did not show up today." He said, "Then who gives you the right to dispense medicine?" So he pulls out a prescription. He said, "Read what's written." So there was 2 items, and one of them was Voltaren, which is used for as an anesthesia. He said, "If I ask you to sell me this, will you sell me this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, this increases blood pressure. Then it means it will hurt me." Then I said, "This is not my problem. The doctor who gave you this prescription should have asked you if you had blood pressure or not." He said, "We are confiscating your pharmacy. Give me the keys to the pharmacy." And I looked at him. I said, "Do you know me?" He said, "No, I don't know you." So I gave them the key to my pharmacy, and they locked it shut for a week until they transferred me to an Islamic court. So after a week, I went, and to this small court, there was this guy. He was a doctor, but he became a judge because it has something to deal with medicine, pharmacies, doctor offices, labs. And he said, "Well, what are you?" I said, "I'm an engineer." He said, "Then how do you run your pharmacy?" I said, "Well, the pharmacist did not show up that day. And I've been working in a pharmacy since I was 10 years old. And I can dispense any medicine better than any pharmacist, officially, of course." He said, "No, you cannot, and we are confiscating your pharmacy." I said, "Well, this, all the medicine that I have in my pharmacy is not mine. This belongs to a drugstore that sells us on loan, and then we sell, and then we pay back." So he looked at me. He said, "Well, you still have to pay it." I said, "This is not fair." He said, "Well, I will ask you a question. What happens if your pharmacy burns down to the ground and every medicine is burnt? Will you pay or not?" I said, "Well, I have to pay." He said, "Well, we are taking it." And then some people got into the conversation, and then they said, "Listen, we will be nice to you this time, but you have 3 days to empty your pharmacy, and you will not open your pharmacy again." I said, "Okay, thank you." And I went, I took all the medicine from my pharmacy to my father's pharmacy, and that location was shut forever until I left. So these are 2 extremes.
So but the other man who said, "Anything you need, you come contact us," you didn't reach out to him.
This was about 6 months later, and usually ISIS members, they are not in the same post for a long time. They'll be there for a month, and then they are rotated, and it will disappear.
Yeah.
And I would no way ask a favor for an ISIS member. So
Yeah.
I'd rather shut than ask a favor.
Yeah. Because then you're beholden to them.
Exactly.
And then you might as well be a member of ISIS. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
You know, this is there are so many stories.
There's so many stories.
You know, the crazy thing is, this kind of thing is happening all over the world. And I'm always reminding just American, just because as a teacher, I'm reminding students of all the ways in which they have participated in these kinds of decisions, in which they could put their foot down on something and really harm somebody else's life, and how they would, and it's profoundly disturbing, actually, how quickly someone can turn a corner and be both the judge and the jury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. So you worked for the New York Times, and then were you assigned to a story, or were you, how did you first get involved with Basim?
Sure. So now I'm a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, which is, where I publish. But at the time when I started this, I had applied for grants for reporting. I had just left an investigations team, and I had pitched it to a different outlet that ultimately actually folded while I was doing the reporting. But Basim I met, because, in one of my early reporting trips, I had been, reconstructing a particular town called Ramadi that had been taken over by ISIS and recently liberated, and interviewing people in this one community called Azizia. And so I was meeting all of these different survivors, people who'd been affected by airstrikes, and I was trying to get to the areas around Mosul. I was trying to get to Ramadi. It was very hard to do at the time. And as I'm interviewing all of these survivors, I had heard about Basim because of, his cousin's wife, Zarina Grewal, had written an op-ed in the New York Times about this incident shortly after it happened. And I had read that op-ed, and it had circulated among many people I knew because, Zarina's sister had gone to the University of Michigan, where I had gone to undergrad. And, I'd heard, and I knew Zarina's sister from undergrad, and a lot of the Muslims at the University of Michigan were talking about this particular incident. So I reached out through the family just, as just one of many of the people that I was talking to at the time. And I think it was April or May of 2016, and we met in this, this quiet, this Baghdad cafe, Chichi Cafe. And, Basim was very apprehensive, I think, in the lead up to this. He was, being very non-committal about meeting and giving me the runaround. And I had traveled by road from Erbil to Baghdad because of a visa issue.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. But I think he took me very seriously because at the time the road was very dangerous. And he's like, you did that? You made that journey? And I was like, yes, I really wanted to meet you. And
this is also when you first were on a dangerous part of town, right? And Basim kept saying, no, you have to come closer.
That happened
to it.
later. That happened later. Yeah. So this is
our first meeting.
Our first meeting was I took like a trip on a road that many people say don't travel this road right now, and Basim was like, okay, she really made an effort to come meet me, and we had a few hours long conversation in this restaurant.
Remember, you were sitting on the second floor. I said, can you please come down? I cannot go upstairs.
Yeah, because you were injured still. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I didn't even think about that. I was trying to find a quieter space in this restaurant. And yeah, we met, we talked, and I got the facts of his case. We discussed what had happened, and over months and months, I kept returning and talking to him and started to push on his particular case, which was different than many of the others that I'd been looking at, specifically because the coalition had uploaded a video of this incident. And so often the US-led coalition had the ability to deny that it carried out an airstrike because maybe it was the Iraqi Air Force. What proof do you have? And in this case, there was a video, which allowed me a pathway to report it out in detail. And on top of that, Basim had individually reported it himself. And so his case became not just representative of the overall findings, it matched, but it was one that I could trace up through the coalition in a very specific manner. And so that's how I got to know Basim. And he was just a captivating person, as anyone who talks to him knows, is that it's so much bigger. He's so much bigger than what happened to him. This is a person who has manifested ideals of forgiveness, of different ways of looking at the world, and he's just somebody who's captivating and you want to learn more from and talk to and understand. And as a journalist, that's one of the most exciting things you can find.
And so When was when you went to Iraq for the first time, were you interested in going to Iraq, or was it just like the New York Times was like, you're going?
No. At that time, I was not on assignment. I just knew, looking at the coverage coming out of the not just the coverage, the government's claims during that time period, there was, I think, there were very few admitted civilian deaths when I started thinking about this story. It was January of 2016. And at the same time, there were these ludicrous claims about how many ISIS fighters had been killed, in the tens of thousands, like almost the entire number of the estimated number of ISIS fighters to begin with. And because reporters, it's so hard to be on the ground in these places, and it's very difficult to fact check those claims, there was not a lot of pushback on those numbers. But you can tell from looking at them that there is something off, and they were claiming to have not just the most precise aerial campaign in the history of warfare. They were, U.S. officials were saying this will be studied for years to come as novel modern warfare. And I'm looking at these numbers and it just didn't add up. So, I applied for funding grants and I had left and I'd started pitching this. And, I very quickly, especially as I got to sample areas, so it took me several months to get to a space where I could go to, the first town I was able to sample was Kayara. It had just very recently been liberated from ISIS, so I could get into it. And I could travel to it. I could do it without, weird permissions or access issues. And I just started to canvass it. The first trip, I think I was able to go to the sites of 10 different airstrikes in downtown Kayara. The next trip, I was able to go to dozens more. And ultimately, I think I found 60 or so airstrikes in downtown Kayara, or there was a certain number of airstrikes in downtown Kayara. Maybe it was 47 in the sample, the official sample. And, with that, I started to see a portrait of how many civilian deaths were actually happening, and that it was much, much higher than any of the numbers or things we'd seen. And so that was sort of the impetus for this. And, I took it to the Times Magazine, I think, a year into it, and this was nearly a 2-year-long reporting process. And they invested in the story and were really fantastic about it. And we're working on additional things related to this issue, and now I'm working on a book about this. So it's been, the subject of my work since early 2016. So it's been a while, but it's the kind of thing that I think matters to me, accountability in war, and matters to, I think, many conflict journalists, and
matters to many. It matters if people understood what the issues were at stake. It really matters to everybody. Just understanding human beings, right? That most of us are kind and we want justice, so it would really matter to everyone. We just don't take the time to understand what the issues are.
And that's why we were calling these past couple classes War is Personal. Because it should matter to people, and it should have an impact, no matter what's going on. Yeah, and then exactly. As you were talking, I was thinking this is a project you've been working on by yourself. You haven't had really other people come along with you.
I did. So I had a co-author named Anand Gopal who worked with me. He's a sociologist as well as just as you are. And so he helped me design the cluster-based sample as I started to go to these places. And, he was also very helpful in the writing of it, and is just, a very skilled reporter. He has a great book called No Good Men Among the Living, if you ever have a chance to read it, about the war in Afghanistan. I think it's searing and so strong. I was working with him, but he was finishing his PhD at the time, so, he couldn't make these frequent trips. But I was talking to him a lot, and, talking to a variety of sources and people. And I guess in some ways, sure, it was definitely isolating. I think it was most isolating when it wasn't about being on the ground. It was going to the U.S. military, presenting them with my findings, or sending them the coordinates of these airstrikes and asking them, did you carry these out? And being told, we can't look at this many coordinates for you. That's such an unreasonable request. We'll look at 4, or we'll look at this many of the 103. And I really needed them to tell me, to respond. Did you do this or not? Was this your airstrike? And the sort of back and forth with generals and colonels and people saying, we are not going to honor this, just that kind of, it's one person against, a league of generals and and other military officials. And I think that, sure, that felt isolating, but it was also, I didn't give up, and I had a lot of time. And ultimately, originally I was being told, no, you can't come to this air base, or no, we won't look at these coordinates for you. And ultimately, over time, they did all of those things. I went to that air base. I embedded there. I got them to check every single coordinate. And as a result of that, I was able to call them out very precisely on the fact that, for one thing, in many cases, they couldn't identify their own airstrikes. They told me, no, it's unlikely that we did this. And then I would find one of their own videos showing that they had. It was integral, but that was the part that I found probably the hardest in terms of, as an individual person, going back and forth, you against an institution over what's true, and constantly being told sometimes, like, no, that's not what happened, that's incorrect, and then ultimately being able to prove that they were wrong about that. It was just aggressive back and forths, and me producing more information. And
then their response when you were able to show them definitively that they were wrong. What was the response of the average?
It depended. Really? So in one case, they said, look, we didn't conduct those airstrikes, and I would show them I would present them with a video, and I'd be like, hey, looks like this video is that location. Can you tell me why you said it was unlikely? Is this not the same location? They would respond with something like, yes, it was the same location. We've looked at this more closely. It does appear to match. And after several back and forths, they would say something like, well, it appears that, our log only, there were 5 airstrikes carried out in 1 hour, and our logs only included one of the GPS coordinates, not all 5. In one case, somebody just said, look, I can only tell you what the strike log shows. And they've now seen the video that shows that it is in fact the place that they're talking about. In one case, it was in the lead up to publication. Based on my reporting, I had concluded that the very first payment offer made in the entire anti-ISIS air campaign for a civilian death was to Basim. That was what my reporting showed. I had found these other offers, and we presented it during the fact check. I'd already asked about it, and they said, no, we made another payment offer for death. And I said, are you sure it was for death? I have no record of that. And they said, yes, you're wrong. And they kept telling me this. And I did a lot of digging because I knew what they possibly thought an offer was. And it wasn't for death. It was for the destruction of a vehicle. And I found the woman whom they had paid for the destruction of her vehicle. I found the letter the military gave her. It from the original email addresses from the military officials who gave it to her, had a translate, whatever, and worked it up back to the fact checkers, and brought it back. And in the morning, it was literally a few hours before the story closed, I get an email from this from this spokesperson who's been denying this over and over and over and over, and finally says, turns out that was incorrect. My assessment earlier was incorrect. This was the first, whatever. So ultimately it happened, but it just took a lot of back and forth.
Okay, so help me with something. This would be a good conversation for us, and we can come back to it. It kind of actually goes back to last week's conversation a little bit. So when I was younger in college and in grad school and starting my academic career, I was definitively on the left. Like really, I think when I was in graduate school, I started reading about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and it really just turned me left hard. Just distrusting the government, distrusting the military, seeing the kinds of lies and manipulations and political shenanigans, and supporting dictators and supporting anti-democratic regimes and genocide and just supporting death. And that's just how I saw the world. And I continue to believe that that's a piece of the world. There's no question. But then as I got further into things and began to see things in more complex ways, and talking to more people, and including talking to people on the ground, including in the military, who were really active in some of these things, realizing that there's so much that people themselves didn't know or didn't understand or didn't see, or just wanted to believe the best. They weren't lying and manipulative and hateful and really wanting to do harm to other people, but they just didn't fully see what was going on in their own world. You know, we're all living really complex lives, so I don't have time to go out and study and understand all the things that I need to study and understand, but yet I have to walk in my classroom and say something about ISIS, let's say, but I'm going to say a lot of really dumb things or I'm not going to say anything, or I'm going to say a lot of dumb things because I don't have the kind of information, let's say, that you have, right? So my assessment, this is now I'm getting to my question. So my assessment of the military has been, gosh, I keep meeting people. You know, I finally sit down years ago with people who are in special forces and people who are on the ground and doing some really terrible things in Afghanistan. And, you know, I think about Bill Edmonds, who, you know, we had a conversation with him, a lieutenant colonel who wrote a book called God Is Not Here, right? Really powerful book about his experience in Mosul in interrogating prisoners who really were out trying to do harm to other people, right? So, and I start to see, wow, the world's more complex. And so I'm asking, the reason I asked you that question was, so is it that the military is, how many of these people, what's your gut assessment, are really deliberately lying to you or about this issue of civilian casualties versus I really don't want to believe that it's as bad as it is, and so we're going to put these assessments out there. I mean, there are clearly some people who are just dark and evil, and they're just manipulative, and that's it. But what I see is it seems like the majority of people just want to believe the best, and they want to believe the best in their institution, the best of the people around them, and they're going to turn a blind eye to some things that they don't understand. And like you say, they don't have time to be on the ground, and they can't be on the ground anyway doing the kind of work you're doing. They could have paid for you to somebody like you or anthropologists, and I know there are military anthropologists doing this kind of stuff, but mostly it's just a certain level of denial, not because they're evil, but rather because they're just in denial. What's your gut?
I think it's a mix of things. And as a reporter, it's my job to understand the truth. And there's some things to which I will never get to that truth, right? I have, I can't tell somebody's motivations in some cases. You know, I can only show what I found out. But overall, here's what I found. There are many people I've met in the military who have written me privately or have contacted me, particularly after the story came out, to say, we are so glad you're doing this. This was so necessary. They care about this issue, and especially among those I interviewed, they really value this. And they will tell me, you know, we take more precautions than any other military in the world. We care about this so much. We're not like the Russians or the Syrian Air Force, which are bombing hospitals and civilians with impunity. We're different. And that's certainly the case. There are many people across the board who care about this issue. There are some who I think, you know, there's not a prioritization of this issue when it comes to truly understanding the scale of civilian death among some. And so that's maybe why those logs were messy. That's potentially why, and you know,
Because it just doesn't matter that much.
You start to ask more questions. Well, why doesn't it matter right now? Like, what are the causes for that? And one of the things I did was a literature review of the advances in civilian casualty protections, just to begin with. You know, how did we go from the era in which we carpet bombed entire cities and talked about, you know, mass civilian death with very little care for, how did we go from that to what we have today? This like system that we are now touting, understandably, is better than every other military's. You know, how did we get there? What was the cause for that? And most of those protections actually came out of the post-Vietnam the Vietnam anti-war movement.
Yep.
You know, and so when you think about why isn't this being prioritized today, in the past you could see where there was widespread public support for the prioritization of these kinds of issues. In the current context, there is no really strong anti-war movement today. In fact, war as we've traditionally understood it and anti-war movements have traditionally occurred when U.S. soldiers are losing lives. And when we've shifted to airstrikes and unmanned drones and fewer actual U.S. soldiers on the ground, the public is less aware that we're at war when we're losing fewer of our own, which is understandable. So when the country doesn't really know we're at war and there is not that kind of lens of accountability, that critical lens on the war taking place, you're less likely to see the responsiveness from officials to prioritize this. And, it really comes down to whether or not people care, and, based on my reporting and the literature review I did.
And they want to get the bad guys, and you're just more likely to turn a blind eye, just trying to get the job done and trying to really do the work that you think you need to do.
Azmat, can you shed some light on the FOIAs you're filing and on the new Gumshoe group that you're working on, because it's tremendous?
So one of the major blocks in all of this work is that the military will tell you we are conducting our assessments, we're conducting our own investigations. As they told Basim this as well, we don't get to see the results of that. Why did they make the assessment that Basim's homes were an ISIS target? Apparently those assessments exist. There's intelligence that they apparently used. What was that? And so while I was reporting the uncounted, I started to go after those assessments. And I went after Basim's, and I obtained that in record timing because of an argument that that I made about potential harm to life. And I, in 5 months, had gotten the assessment into Basim's case. And then I started, I'd already started looking for these other assessments, these claims of civilian death, both credible and non-credible. And over the next year and a half, I basically asked for what were around 1,300 of these assessments. And I asked for them through the Freedom of Information Act, which allows members of the public to request government records. And ultimately, my requests were ignored, and so I worked with some lawyers to sue the Department of Defense for those records. And now, every few months I get these large document dumps of those assessments, and I've been going through them. These assessments are from Iraq and Syria. A majority of them were deemed non-credible, so civilian casualty allegations that were reported that the military decided were not civilian casualties.
On the basis of...
Well, that's what I'm finding out as I go through them. It's really fascinating because they'd originally denied many that later on they had to accept. Ones they denied that I'd reported or that had previously been reported, and then I came back with evidence they had to accept. And so it's a variety of different things. But as I now have been going through these documents and looking at this particular war, I started to look at, well, what's happening in other war zones? These are for Iraq and Syria. I've been digging into Afghanistan, and so I started to request civilian casualty assessments from Afghanistan and start the same process. And as I'm doing this and I'm getting all of these documents, I'm realizing there is actually the potential. Like, I'm one person drowning in thousands of documents, and there are some journalists who've done incredible work in Somalia and elsewhere. And so I'm working with basically to teach other journalists how I filed these, how I got them, how I sued, how they can get them too, how to share them with one another. And I have an organization I launched with another journalist called the Gumshoe Group that basically pairs journalists like myself with lawyers who are willing to fight in lawsuits like mine for public records for journalists. And one of the projects I'm doing through Gumshoe is literally to get these civilian casualty documents for a bunch of different journalists in different parts of the world. And then there are other projects related to it. But it's an attempt to essentially hold the government accountable for, what it claims, looking at those documents meticulously, publicizing them, getting them out into the public, because for so long they've been denied to the public. We don't get to read them. We don't get to see it. But I think, Basim, you can talk about what it was like for you, and just to kind of put this in perspective, what it was like for him after, nearly 2 years of trying to get answers as to why he was targeted. What was it like for you to read when ultimately I got the document on your case? What was it like to read what they said?
It was around 12 pages. Most of it is redacted. So to understand what's happening in that document, most of the information that is critical is redacted, blacked out. And we had a lawyer who worked for me, pro bono from DC law firm, and they tried to get these documents and what do you call it? What's the term?
Pro bono?
No, to remove the
redaction?
Yeah, to remove them, but
To remove the
to remove
the
redaction,
redaction,
to
yeah.
understand what the document was talking about.
Yeah.
Even my name was redacted,
Yeah.
but we couldn't get anywhere with that.
That's almost impossible.
It is impossible.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a feature of the post 9/11 environment. You know, things are now routinely labeled, as top secret or as for official use only or whatever it might be, citing national security concerns. And I think that it requires a really rigorous and expensive pushback. Like, we can't all just start filing lawsuits every day as journalists to try to get things. But I think there's been a shift in mentality as to what the public is owed in this sort of national security state after 9/11, this idea that we can deny on these grounds in ways that we haven't in the past. We've seen a lot of that, and I think that it's something that the public should really be paying attention to, because this is information, these are wars that are being fought in our names, and that information, whether good or bad, right? We can find things in these documents. Maybe I'm finding things that are also like very positive about this. We should know the realities of that. I'm not an advocate. I don't have an agenda. My understanding, I just want to know the truth.
Well, there's just a great danger in not knowing. Ironically, the left and the more extreme right come together on this issue, right? And both being able to talk about the grave dangers, right? This of where ultimately we could go, and it's ultimately where we are. I mean, where we are going if we're not waking up to this. Hey, is there anybody? So what are a few quick questions on the stream?
I have a question that was asked yesterday to Basim. There seemed to be some people who believed that, what was their terminology? That we were forcing you to rehash your story, and that we were trying to just exploiting and using you for an hour of class time. And I want to know your honest response to that.
Well, my story was told a year and a half before I came to this class. So what I was doing in class is shed light for 750 people who knew probably very little about what happened in my case or what's happening in Iraq. So you were not hashing and you're not forcing me to do anything.
We didn't force you to get onto the
No,
plane.
sir, no.
No.
You didn't.
Including the people of the conversation as opposed to just talking about them, I think is important. I think it came up a couple of weeks ago in a different podcast. I forget what we were talking about, but I think it's important to. I think you coming is a level above just having someone else from Iraq. If it's you specifically, I think it's a step above having a representation of the people that we discuss. So I think that's better. It's not negative.
I'm happy to be that person, and I'm humbled to be here.
I do have a question,
also,
though.
real quick, just to add, you've seen him transition over time. In the beginning, when we first met, it was very hard for him to talk about this. And it took a long time to get him to open up. And I remember by the time of publication, I was very worried about him talking to, others and recounting the night of. And he said, no, it's fine. I'm actually, through this process, it's still difficult, of course, but it had lessened and he desired more and more to talk about it. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, is that it's changed. The hurt of it has changed.
Part of the healing. It was really a part of the healing, just to talk about it, get everything out, and yeah. And
this
so
is
many people to thank for who are in this room now.
And this is part of all grief work.
Yeah.
And I think that, we get this a lot, or I get a certain pushback from people, right, on the chat oftentimes, because I'm really willing to go to the kinds of places that I know that we need to go. People need to go. To talk about it's the inner work, not just the outer work. And so, any other?
Yes, for me. Just listening about the on the ground firsthand stuff, and I was thinking something that was going through my mind after the conversation from last week. But the question is, do you think what you see from the avenues of what the military, how they go about relaying or not relaying information, or the hassle that you need to go through to receive such information, and the roles and the orders that people follow, whether they're military, police, ISIS reflects a level of integrity, or is it more complex with how individuals battle with their integrity and loyalty, or is everyone just following orders?
That's a good question. I mean, and it's hard for me to answer. That's why it's a great question. But I think on the one hand, I fought that process and went through many hurdles when it came to Iraq and Syria, and felt by the end of it, wow, there's a real lack of transparency here, and you can see it in how hard it was for me to get this, and that's a problem. But at the same time, there were so many officials and people who helped on that, who did ultimately talk to me and were fascinating and honest, and I incorporated that into the story. And afterward, I was hearing from all of these people, and when I think about integrity, I think, wow, like this is, I see integrity in these spaces or in certain places when it comes to just that part of it. But it's so much bigger than me and that back and forth, right? It's about an entire institution. And as I've been, for example, doing this work with respect to Afghanistan, I have gotten a kind of response that suggests an even more grave lack of transparency, and something that is deeply troubling to me. When it comes to Afghanistan right now, looking at what is happening there and the lack of transparency these officials are making the campaign in Iraq and Syria and the transparency there look like a dream. That's how bad it is. And so I think, I don't know how, ultimately when I'm done with that reporting, will I come out of this thinking these officials exhibited integrity? Well, that's not my job. I'm just a journalist. But it's something that I think about, and I know that many people who are in the military think about integrity and their duty and transparency. And I do hope, just as a journalist, that that will come to fruition in this case, because we are, the American public is owed answers.
Hey, what's the title of your book, by the way?
The working title is Precision Strike.
Precision Strike.
Do you
published
think
by Random House? Yes.
Do you think that in all of your journey and travelings and your approach to officials, was there anything in your mind that deterred you from them, just from being a woman? Or do you think because you're a woman, you were able to make the jumps that you were?
You don't want to talk about being a woman?
Can we let Basim answer that?
In so many places and spaces, I actually found being a woman an asset. And so just, for example, the ground reporting in Iraq, I was going to places where journalists are not really allowed to go in some of these places, or there were certain periods in which there would be lockdowns on media access. And so, one of those towns was called Shora. And when I arrived there, what likely would have happened had I been a male is I would have been, kind of detained by the security forces there and, sent back to Erbil or whatever it might be. But because I'm a woman, they took my passport, but they sat me down for tea and basically said, "Little girl, what are you doing here? Let's chat." And, I had told them I'm just interested in what life was like under ISIS, and I wanted to talk to people about that, which is accurate. And they said, "Fine, we want to come with you." And I said, "Okay, that's no problem." But in my head, I'm thinking I can't do the interviews I need to do with official minders around me. So I guess I have to do other kinds of interviews. So I interviewed people for days about healthcare and life under ISIS. And then eventually I was like, well, I'll start asking really boring questions about teeth and healthcare, like dental care, basically. And you could just see these officials getting bored out of their minds, and they finally just left me alone. And I was just like this harmless girl walking through these places, interviewing people about their teeth, and I was able to do my interviews without those minders. So, in some ways, being a woman is incredibly helpful in these spaces and places. You're underestimated. You were allowed access to places. And in others, maybe there are challenges. I think that there are challenges for everybody in terms of I think this reporting is expensive and hard to break into. So if you come from a class background that makes that hard to do, if you're journalism, a lot of people break into it doing unpaid internships, but how do you get abroad? How do you do this? How do you fund this? What does it take? I mean, I think that there are lenses through which, gender, race, et cetera, that you can look at class that make things difficult for people or more easy. Sometimes people can relate to other people better when they're both blue collar, whatever it might be, or working class. And there are all of these things that are assets and strengths and weaknesses, and it just depends. But yeah.
A question on the channel: when do you expect the book to be out?
Well, the manuscript is due in March, so I am working feverishly towards that deadline, and then it will go through edits, but we will see.
When it comes out, you all will know. Because we'll have them.
Yeah. Well, listen, any other quick questions that you feel like we really need to respond to? I think the one that you just asked Basim was really important and valuable.
The only thing I can think of is about current events with the Kurds.
Yeah, I don't want to dig into that.
Yeah,
That'll be
because
way
that
too
would be another
complex.
hour-long conversation.
But what I would like to say is that following from this idea, the title of the two classes this week, War is Personal, as soon as I heard, last weekend when I sort of recognized what was starting to happen, I just knew that how much pain was about to be unleashed, and and sadness and grief was going to happen. Are there any crazy comments on the chat?
No.
Somebody asked about, do you feel any responsibility for the portrayal of military personnel in your stories?
I've talked to some of the people who are portrayed in it, and I made a really good faith effort to get to the, to get to this base and do those interviews, and you'll see in this, there are very particular passages that talk about no one is happy. None of these soldiers, none of these people are happy with civilian casualties. They see it through this lens, and here's why, and here's how they see it as understandably more precise than some of these other countries. And I put that in context. And so I'm just looking at this, and somebody's asking, how do you feel about people who were demonized for serving in the military? I don't think anyone was demonized for serving in the military. In fact, if you compare this reporting to other reporting on this, you see a really, really good faith effort to interview as many of these people as possible and put that in perspective, while also centering the voices of people who were on the receiving ends of that violence. People like Basim, I think you have a tendency to see stories that will do either or, where they will just interview military officials about the costs of war and the trauma of doing this, or you will see stories that, just talk to victim. I put in my best faith effort to incorporate that as much as possible, so I would strongly dispute. In fact, I think it's factually inaccurate to say anybody was demonized. And I've heard from many people, who did speak to me later and say, well, that was fair, it was accurate. Like, I didn't like to read this. It wasn't fun for me to see the impact of this. It's unsettling, especially when we work so hard and we try so hard to know that, this is what's happening. But demonization, no.
Yeah, and when you say especially when we try so hard, but what about when we think we're trying hard and we're not, and we're wrong? And it's important that we are able to hold a mirror up to ourselves and see where we're missing or where we're falling short. And I think that you are offering just your research by going out into communities and digging around and talking to people. You are offering the military an opportunity to see where it's falling short, and then it can decide what it wants to do. I mean, clearly we're not doing what we did in Cambodia, right? And in Vietnam, and we're not doing what we did in Dresden, right? To go back that far, and to go back how far? I mean, we can just go back, and the examples are almost endless. But yet, who do we want to be? How right do we want to be? How accurate?
But it's also let's think about the victims here. Like, who are the victims in this situation? Like, that is important. Who are the real victims in this story?
And who are we if we're not willing to consider the victims?
And on top of that, also just this idea that, we went to such great lengths to portray the process, the bureaucratic hurdles, the great efforts at investigating this. I spent hours and hours sort of reconstructing that. And, to put that in there and to still feel like, I mean, what kind of portrayal are people expecting? Like,
exactly.
This is war.
Exactly.
Like, what, are there only heroes in war? Is that the only way you can look at this?
If I would have put the photos up so we had 5 photos that we were going to put up, and then we just never got to them, right? If I would have put those photos up, and I think about the one with the young boy and the burns on his arm and so on, if people would there would have been people who said, I should never put that up. I have no right to put that up. And that was really just wrong of us to do that. And I think, well, why? Because you have to see the photo. You have to see what our bombs did, and we have to see and so that's just the. I don't even respond to that sort of argument anymore. I mean, in my work and the way I teach and the way I operate, I don't even respond. It's like, if you think that you don't have to look at victims in that way, then you don't. I don't need to talk to you. You're not part of the process. So, I'm never going to convince anybody. But again, what I think you've come to through your work, you've come to the conclusion that I've come to, which is the vast majority of people are trying to do a good job in whatever it is they're doing, and the vast majority of people are not mean-spirited and want to harm others. And sometimes we turn away for reasons. And the most recent flare-up with LeBron James, right, of sort of making the guy, it's like, hey, is this really about profit, or is there something else behind it? Okay, that's a different story. What we're talking about are people that, like I have examples in class sometimes where a student maybe gets bullied or something, and I just don't do what I need to do to reach out and fix the situation. Why? Because I'm busy doing other things, and I'm responsible for that. And I made a choice not to reach out and fix a problem between students, and I have to take responsibility of that. I can blame lots of other people. I can say I'm just too busy. No. In the end, I want to be better tomorrow than I am today, and so it's incumbent upon me to do that. And I think you're offering the military an opportunity to do that, and that's phenomenal and amazing. You're also offering people an opportunity to look at these things in different ways. Okay. Any final comments? Do you want to respond to anything from the chat at all, or do you have anything?
Well, just this last question says, Basim, with the shootings in the U.S., do you feel safer back home or not? I feel safe anywhere I go because whatever is written for me will happen, and I'm at peace with myself.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Did any of your friends or family say anything to you?
No.
Because Rafi always says that when he comes from Afghanistan, that his family, there are people that don't want him to come here because they're afraid for his safety. And you, Azmat, are there? I know when you spend your time living, I don't think about going into somewhere in an active shooter. How about you? Think about being in Syria or Iraq. Are there times when you're more afraid here than there? Because I felt immensely safe in Iraq. I feel safe everywhere I go. I never feel unsafe. But
trying to think about the last time that I felt really unsafe, and I take such precautions that I think there's always a feeling of fear. Like wherever I'm going, I'm constantly in these reporting situations. I'm afraid, but being afraid is one thing. I think that makes me stay safe, but whether or not there's an actual real credible threat is something else, right? So I don't know. I do think that I operate really safely. There have been moments in which I've been tense and have then done more preparations or more work or whatever it might be. But in the U.S., when do I feel unsafe? I think that women at certain hours walking around may feel unsafe. There are things that make everyone feel that way.
Hey, you know what? I just got word. We got to get Basim back to Pond. He's doing it.
Down here.
No. Oh my God. No. You got another one.
What is he doing in Pond?
He's got a meeting. Hey, listen. So thanks for listening. Thanks for everything. And
I have to say my thing. So we're sponsored by World in Conversation and now Anchor, where you can put all your podcasting needs. And then I just wanted to say to both of you guys, first of all, Basim, you're one of my favorite people in the world.
Thank you so much.
And simply just because of your ability to forgive people. And Azmat, thank you so much for being able to spread his story so more people can hear it, because more people need to learn how to forgive. And I think you're one of the best examples of that. So thank you so much.
I had so many friends last year when I was here, and then I had virtual friends. Now I added more to last year. I'm blessed. Thank you so much to have me here.
And for my final thought, thank you for bringing journalism to the standard in which it needs to be, because
Yes.
there's so much criticism with it. When you actually go out and do real reporting, people are like, well, that's not real reporting. But honestly, after talking to you for an hour and a half, what you did, especially with his story and many others, it's awesome. All right. Are we out?
We go out in the world and conversate, people. Drink your water and be good.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. See you all on Tuesday, the gay class on Tuesday.